Hello everybody, we're going to be doing chapter 11 of Tsotsi by Athol Fugard today. Tsotsi finally traced Boston to a shebeen bossed by a woman called Marty. Boston had found himself there shirtless, shoeless, wearing only an old pair of khaki trousers held up by a belt of fibrous yellow rope. He was lying in a corner of the room, on the floor, lost to the world in a stupor which had lasted now for the 3 days that had passed since Tsotsi's attack, and out of which he had awoken at times, only to lurch off in search of still more booze. Spit bubbles burst as he breathed through his lips because his nose was blocked with blood. Tsotsi came just in time. As he slipped quietly to the door, the woman, Marty, was standing over Boston, nudging him with her foot and speaking in a deep, disgusted voice. Hey, wake up! Wake up and get out, man! I'm sick of you, bloody dog. The other occupants of the room, 2 men who were watching idly, were over their drinks. Throw him out, she said. Throw out the bloody dog. He's pissed again on the floor. No one had seen Tsotsi in the door, with the result that when he spoke there was an immediate reaction. Marty swung around, and the men made a quick move to hide their glasses. Leave him, said Tsotsi. What do you want? She asked. Him, nodding his head at Boston. Marty left the corner and walked right up to Tsotsi, standing so that she blocked his way. She didn't fear a damn thing. You're the one that did it, she said. Tsotsi said nothing to say in reply. You work for him like he is. Lying down, he said, when he couldn't see because the blood was in his eyes. Tsotsi watched her to finish. He looked over her shoulder at the men, who dropped their eyes, then at the ceiling where a piece of flypaper crusted over with dead bodies hung beside the light. Marty had come so close to him that when she spoke, small drops of spit flew into his face. I wouldn't do that to a dog. Not a mad dog, and I'm telling you he was a man. So what you got to say? She waited. Tsotsi waited. I'm telling you that, she pointed back, but without taking her bright, indignant eyes from Tsotsi's face. That was a man, I know, some sort of a different man. Well? I want him. Why? Aren't you satisfied? I just want him. To talk. The light faded from her eyes. To talk. Yeah, he could talk. Too much. Marty walked away from him. A big, childless, husbandless woman. At the table she lit a cigarette, smoked it for a few seconds, blowing on the glowing tip of the cigarette. She looked at Boston once, and then shrugged her shoulders. Take him. It's too late. He shouldn't have come back. Tsotsi tried to wake Boston first, but after the shaking he just rolled over. The 2 men watched discreetly, dropping their eyes to their glasses whenever Tsotsi caught them. Marty was at her window, leaning there on her elbows, looking out into the night. He's just pieces, she said, just pieces held together by dried blood, like something broken. Boston stank as bad as a backyard. He had also messed on his trousers. Who wants pieces, Marty was saying. Who the hell wants the pieces of a man? Tsotsi carried him away in his arms. It took him a long time to get back to his room. At first, Boston was quiet, and apart from the weight, it was easy going through the crooked streets, past the idle curiosity of people waiting at their windows for another rain, or lounging about outside. "What's that mean?" they asked themselves and each other. "That man there, hey, carrying that one like a baby." They knew the basic meaning: trouble. That was the meaning of most things. But the form of it, the variations that life composed, playing on that one theme, they were infinite. Was it a brother, father, or friend? Was he alive, dead, or dying? Who did it, anyway, and why? What exactly had been done? About halfway to his room, Boston spoke. Tsotsi heard him groan, but it was only when they reached the light of a lamppost that he knew for certain he was awake. One eye was open wide and staring back. When Boston saw who it was that carried him, he gave a small cry, and with a flurry of legs and arms broke loose and fell to the ground. He staggered up and went lurching away into the darkness, still crying in a strong nasal tone because of his blocked nose. Tsotsi followed him as he stumbled, off the pavement and into the gutter, then on the pavement again, but now on his knees because he had fallen over the curb, finally crawling a few more yards until he came to rest under the corrugated iron fence. There was a slogan on it: "We won't move." But Boston did, a few seconds later. Tsotsi pulled him to his feet, and because he was awake and took one of his arms over his shoulders and helped him like that along another stretch of the way to his room, he lost consciousness again and had to be carried for the last few blocks. In his room, Tsotsi lay Boston on the bed, took off his trousers and threw them into the yard where the small dog found them later. He turned away from the window and stopped immediately, drawing in his breath with excitement. He had lit a candle on the first entering the room, and by its willowy light and the perspective of a few feet, he now saw all that there was of Boston, stretched naked on the bed. In the shebeen, and had been carrying him through the streets, he had deliberately deferred the moment of really looking at him, so that through the touch of his hands and his eyes he could feel him the way he had felt the cripple. But this time there was no preamble to the experience. As he turned away from the window, it hit him. Boston was thinner than he had ever imagined. His ribs stood out clearly, pressing against the skin with the effort of each breath, which seemed to arch his body. In the uncertain light, his legs were out of all proportion to the rest of him. Tsotsi went to the bed and examined him carefully, so absorbed in his purpose that he hardly felt the liquid wax fall to the back of the hand holding the candle. The head was almost misshapen, and by the blue swellings on the forehead. One eye was so swollen that all that remained of it was a straight fold of skin. Even as Tsotsi looked, a few drops of colourless liquid oozed out and trickled down the cheek. Impulsively, he put out his hand and caught one drop on his finger. He tasted it. Tears. Tsotsi straightened up and scratched off the candle wax on the back of his hand. He was trembling. He bent down again. From the eyes he moved slowly to the nose, the clotted mass of blood and broken bone, then to the mouth and the cuts about the chin. Very lightly, he put a hand on Boston's chest. The flesh was warm and living and felt like pain. It was red as pain, too, where he had broken it open. Tsotsi straightened up again and went to the table where he put the candle down. His head was spinning. He'd held his breath during the examination, and now his heart raced and his stomach was convulsing. Tsotsi sat down and waited for the dizziness and nausea to pass. Then he counted his money. 2 shillings. What did he expect after 3 days without a job? 2 shillings. It would buy a loaf of bread and a tin of sour milk. He blew out the candle and left the room. It took 10 minutes to buy the food. When he returned, he struck a match and had another look at Boston. He hadn't moved. Tsotsi sat down in the dark. I won't light the candle, he thought. It's short. I'll need it when he talks. He ate some of the bread, drank half the milk, and waited. Walter Boston Nujuza, born at Umtata, the son of a humble, tired old woman, educated there to Standard 8 at St. John's College, promising pupil, nearly always first in his class, mother very proud, scholarship to St. Peter's High School, Johannesburg, at this period a small, shrunken youth with spectacles, too serious. No luck with the girls, then the training college for teachers, again a scholarship, mother, older but very proud. At the end of his first year, having studied until he was almost a wreck, Walter Juza came first in his class. A man with a future. You'll go far, Njuza. Serve your people, etc., etc. Mother, very proud. The second year, after a loss of appetite and another supreme effort, again head of his class. Take it easy, Boston boy. You'll go off the rails, man. Still shrunken. Still wearing glasses. Still no progress with the girls. But his mother, very, very proud. Third and final year. He never wrote the final examinations for the diploma, because in June that year he was expelled for trying to rape a fellow student. Once, in the years that followed the warm, storm-expectant high felt a night in June, he was 24 years old as he lay on Tsotsi's bed. Boston, during an idle moment, written down the summary of his early career. He was proud of it. Simple, concise, no sentiment, no unnecessary detail. The straight, rising line of a life, of a hungry boy, a lonely youth, a desperate young man, rising in a clean curve to the point where it broke. The precise spot was a grove of trees near the college tennis courts at 10 o'clock on that June night. He had read it out once to a bunch of the boys. Go on, they said when he was finished. He blinked at them. He had already given up wearing glasses. In some ways, and for some things, it was better not to see. Go on, they said. What happened? There is nothing more to tell. Afterwards, there is nothing more to tell. It all ended that night. Yeah, it's all finished. Everything. Finished as dead as cigarette ash. Tell about the girl, then. What is there to tell? You tried your luck with her? Yeah. Just like that? Yeah. It was the one story Boston could not spin out. Not even during the long afternoons in Tsotsi's room, waiting there with him and Butcher and the ARP for darkness. In the years that had passed, he tried only once. I didn't do it. I tell you I didn't. Not the way they thought I did. I was out walking. Hell, I remember. I was sick of the books and scared. You believe that. I was already scared of the exams. It was a warm night, I'm telling you. That sort of night still gives me creeps under my skin. Near the tennis courts, I bumped into this girl. She was also a student. Like I was telling you, I never had any luck with the girls. But it had got so bad I was scared of them. When I saw her there, I wanted to run, but she started to talk. What could I do? What did I know about what she had in her mind? You see, she just wanted to play. But I tell you, I had no luck with the girls. So when she came near me, I started rubbing. Hell, was that a hot night. You see, I didn't know when to stop. I didn't know that you went just so far and no further. She started screaming, and they came running and found me. She was all in tears, but I mean, what could I do? What could I say? That's how it happened. Could you now honestly say he was to blame? Or the girl, for that matter, and the others, the stern-faced, the disappointed, the shocked? Njuza, no! They had come running only when it was already over. His mother? There was a thought there, but in the end it didn't matter who was to blame, because it came down to the same thing. Walter Njuza packing his few things and leaving the college, saying to himself, numbly, it's a mistake. That was putting it in a nutshell. A mistake. Couldn't really even call it an injustice. Since then he'd had an obsession with mistakes, and had seen so many of them, for some men even died, like that fool Gumboot, that in his 24th year he had finally arrived at what he called the philosophy of error. It's a mistake, he said, when he was drunk, which was the time when he saw it clearest. The whole bloody thing, from beginning to end, from Adam to Walter Boston Njuza, was one big mistake. No kidding. He went straight from the college to the railway station and spent his whole day there waiting for the train. Had it been a morning train, he might have avoided the biggest mistake of all, not going home, because that is what happened. He was given too much time to brood on the image of a tired, getting old, very proud woman hoeing in the fields. He could see her shield her eyes from the sun and look down the road, and seeing him come running to the hut to meet him. Mother, he went no further. It was too painful. With himself, Boston was honest, but to his mother he lied. In the corner of the platform where he sat, he said aloud, I don't have enough courage, and then took out a sheet of paper and wrote back home, Dear Mother, good weather, healthy boy, missing her. He'd finished his studying earlier than expected and was so going to look for a post up here. It would take time. Be patient. So don't let Mr. Mabuza write your letters to the college. I'm not there anymore. Would let her have an address too soon. Everything fine. He put it into an envelope, addressed it, then threw away his ticket and hurried out of the station building. Carrying his suitcases, he wandered aimlessly through the city, sleeping at night wherever he could find shelter, waiting for some miracle to sort out the mess he'd made of his life. A week was spent like this, and all that Boston subsequently remembered was the moment at the very end when he discovered that the last of his money was gone and he was hungry. Fate stepped in and took over when he was on the verge of surrendering himself to the disgrace he had tried to avoid in not going home. John Boy Lethwetwa. He would always remember that name, because although they had tried to bluff themselves, that was the beginning. John Boy Lethwetwa. The place where they had met was even more distinct, because that was still there, whereas John Boy had passed away like so many others since him. It happened at the pass office, and the time, 10 o'clock, on a cold winter's morning. He had ended up there because a vaguely distant relative was supposed to work there, and if blood ties meant anything, the man might be prepared to help. He had taken up a position near the fence, sitting on his 2 suitcases. There was a lot to think about before he found him, like a basic issue of do or don't. If he did, would the news get back to his mother? The relative was bound to ask questions. Even if he didn't, what did he, Boston, expect from the man? Money? Food? A place to sleep? Work? Boston looked around. It was certainly the right place to evaluate his bleak needs and prospects. The centre of all interest was the pass offices themselves, a collection of squat, ugly, rambling barrack-type buildings, a hangover from the Great War that had been waged in his youth, but somewhere else, broken down and reassembled here. The building stood in the centre of a wind-swept, barren piece of land. They had tried to grow flowers once. 2 elderly black men had laid out the bed and painted flowers and watered them, only to watch them grow a little and then shrivel up and die. "It's too salt," they had said, looking at each other and knowing what they meant. "The soil is too salt over here." So on head officer's suggestion, the neat diamonds and ovals and border strips of the bed had been filled with white gravel. Outside these white glaring patches, the earth was bare. It was kept permanently free of weeds by the thousands of feet that trembled there, hopelessly each day. Along the perimeter of the grounds was a high fence, and beyond that a pavement with a little grass, where men and women sat out the lunch hours with packets of chips, bought from an Indian shop across the road, waiting for the offices to open and another adventure into the intricacies of native administration. The grass was a dry, burnt-out brown around Walter Boston Ujuza, sitting on his suitcases, and there were white patches of frost from the previous evening. The man strolled up and sat on the grass beside him. He was short, stockily built, with humour in his eyes. They exchanged a few pleasantries before the stranger said, "I see by your glasses that you are a reading man." Boston nodded. The other one thereupon handed him a slip of paper he had in his hand. "What does that say?" he asked. Boston read it. "It says you can't work at Natty Outfitters because your last employer did not sign your book." Johnny Lethwa took back the paper and nodded his head. "That's what I thought. What's it mean? They'll pick me up?" "Yeah." "Why didn't he sign it?" Boston asked. "I was in jail," John Boy said. "Why?" "For not having a previous employer." "Let me see your pass." John Boy gave it to him. This was the sort of problem that had always put him ahead of his class. Words on paper. He read it carefully. The instructions. Then taking out a pen, he signed his name, with appropriate date, then time. He handed it back to John Boy. "There, you've got a previous employer," he said. "Is that a fact?" murmured the other. He examined it carefully before putting it away. He stood up and walked away into the crowd. Thinking he had seen the last of him, Boston considered his problem again and decided it would be best if he found his relative to inquire about work. If the man was a gentleman, he himself would suggest food. Boston stood up and was on the point of leaving when he saw John Boy. He was walking slowly towards him, kicking a few stones and practicing soccer passes. He sat down in the same position, looked around very carefully, then took 4 passbooks out of his pocket and handed them to Boston. "Previous employers," he said. Boston took the passbooks, but hesitated. In the meantime, John Boy had taken 4 10-shilling notes out of another pocket. He separated 2 and gave them quietly to Boston. 50-50, he said. Boston took the passes and signed them all. The next time John Boy brought 7, then 4, finally 2. "I think we'd better stop now," John Boy said. "They're beginning to look at me. Let's go and eat." It was 12 o'clock and Boston had over £4 in his pocket. John Boy picked up one of his suitcases and started walking. Boston took another and followed him. "What about Natty Outfitters?" Boston asked. "To hell with them," John Boy said, dribbling a stone with his feet. "We'll specialize in previous employers. Where do you stay?" "Nowhere." "You can sleep with me. I got a room in the hostel. Do you like soccer? I play every Saturday." That night Boston wrote to his mother again. "As you can see from the attached pound note, I am quite happy and have every hope for the future. Health good, miss you. Good friend Dr. J. Lithwetwa, where you can get Mr. Mabuza to compose letter for you and send them to me." John Boy and Boston prospered and went a long way together. From the proceeds of previous employers, they eventually saved enough to buy a few rubber stamps from one of the clerks in the pass office, and so expanded their business to include work seekers' permits, the 48-hour visitor's permit, and a small but lucrative sideline of resident permits for one of the townships. Those stamps, together with an inking pad, which the clerk also sold them, Boston carried in his raincoat pocket. They set up shop wherever the people gathered, like the railway station, the bus terminals, the pass office, John Boy collecting the customers and Boston handling the books and papers. Letters from his mother, written by the shopkeeper, Mr. Mabuza, began to arrive at his new address, full of gratitude for the money and hope for the future. "And when are you coming home?" He answered faithfully and sent her money. Their partnership was only in business. Beyond that, they had nothing in common. Boston didn't mind. He had a lot to think about, and the shebeens were as good a place as any to brood about the old mistakes and the new ones, his own, or those of other people that he had seen. When he wasn't thinking, drinking helped to pass the time and keep his hands busy. He took to it naturally, not noticing what was happening until he was deep and well soaked in the habit. The long nights with nothing to do, a man with few friends and no luck with the girls. John Boy went his own way. Boston stayed on the fringes, you might say, within touching distance of the real thing. There was a gang which frequented the same shebeen. He heard their talk and sometimes added a word of his own. Their real meeting place was Marty's, and he was a frequent visitor. So when a day came when John Boy did not return, and he got the word that he had been picked up with 10 passbooks in his pocket, it was the end to that game. He was not really worried. That night in Marty's, sitting alone in a corner with a glass in his hand, he heard those 3 men discuss a job. They had a problem and were discussing it. It was a simple problem, the solution even simpler, so simple that they were amazed when Boston pointed it out to them. They looked at him in disbelief, while Marty laughed. They gave him a cut, of course, and that was the beginning of the real thing. Before long he was going out with them on jobs, and the letters kept coming from home. They were soul-searching, longing letters, and their loneliness and ignorance of the real nature of things, phrased awkwardly in Mr. Mabuza's stilted language, was as corrosive as acid to his peace of mind. We live in the hope of your return and pray for the future. Should your career bring you to near our humble world, please, my son, will my eyes behold my flesh and blood before I die. Once in desperation he dragged off the best-looking member of the gang. They dressed neatly and had their photograph taken together by a street photographer. "Smile up, gents," he said. Boston sent it home. "Dear Mother, I thought you might like to meet another teacher who is a friend of mine. His name is Butcher Sungile, and we are good friends, etc., etc." In his own world, Boston was the man with the brain, but also a coward who got sick and then drank for days after a rough job. But he was a gentleman. "Please and thank you, and may I, and would you like me to?" That counted for a lot in Marty's eyes. Over a long time and almost unnoticed, they grew very close to each other. Other men came and went in her life, and after each departure he was still there in his corner with his drink and wry smile, with a word about this or that, ready to listen if she wanted to speak, talking on long after the others had gone, staying there into the early hours until the day he did not leave at all. He evoked a deep, frustrated, maternal impulse in her nature. His very clumsiness, his strange attempts at physical cruelty in the act, and the next morning remorse, those were the very things that held her. It ended very abruptly, and a lot more started because of the first killing. The victim was the night watchman of the block of flats, and if they hadn't killed him, they would certainly have been caught. So there was that much to be said about it. But Boston got sick. It was the smell and the feel of blood, and from his stomach the nausea went to his mind. Back in the shebeen he tried to vomit out his muck and misery of his past years in a torrent of words. One drink too many, too blinded to know what he was doing, he had turned on Marty and dragged her down as slow as his words. Marty had taught him all he was ever to know about love. It began as a friendship and ended as a strange, warm interlude that had no precedent and was to have no real sequel to his lonely life. But she became part of his degradation, and he was sick to his soul. She took it without flinching, and because there was so much between them, she let it pass without taking any of the cruel or hard revenge she was capable of. Boston regretted having done it, because in those long years Marty was the nearest he had found to something good, and it was finished. The police turned on the pressure then, and the gang broke up, and for a long time he didn't go near her place. When eventually he did chance his arm one day, it was to be served coldly like the others, coldly, kept at a distance as if nothing had ever passed between them, neither love nor hate. That hurt more than anything else she could have done to him. He kept away again. And 2 years passed before that night, 2 days after Tsotsi had beaten him down. Boston awoke at the darkest hour of the night. Sitting in his chair waiting for him, Tsotsi had heard the time pass as a sequence of sound, starting with early night, the music and the laughing, and through that to a time when the laughing had stopped, and then still later the music as well, voices mumbling, then in sleepy accents, and then almost at the end of the occasional defiant revels of the last one, sudden voices that were shouting until they too passed, and at the last there was silence. The bed creaked, and then Boston asked aloud in the darkness, "Where am I?" Tsotsi left his chair and lit the candle. The two men looked at each other in the wan light. For a moment